Yes, let me start through pantomime to language from transparency to efficiency, and this will be a theoretical talk with a framework where it hopefully all comes together, and it will be a bird's eye view, so there will be many lacunas that may be controversial, which is, so criticism is even encouraged. And apologies to my students who will have to listen to this again. Good. So this is an evolutionary explanation, and I would even say a deep evolutionary explanation. An evolutionary explanation since Darwin of animal morphology, as well as animal behavior, are couched in terms of adaptation through natural selection, or at least adaptation through natural selection is considered to be the main architect of both. Now this view, of course, or at least this view in its extreme form, has been challenged influentially by, for example, Stephen Jay Gould, who pointed out its limitations, such as genetic drift, allometry, physical constraints, phyletic inertia, etc., etc. So, for example, even if it would be perhaps very adaptive for elephants to fly, it is not possible. Flight or wings are not evolvable in elephants for more than one reason, right? So, for example, weight, so physical constraints, phyletic inertia, so there is nothing to grow wings out of in elephants. This would be energetically inefficient, and so on and so forth. So we remember about those limitations, but we set them aside. Sorry. Okay. Yes. So adaptationism should not mean, no worries, should not mean, okay, adaptationism should not mean naive adaptationism, right? So we don't say that all animal behavior is adaptive, but rather we can expect as a default animal behavior to have an adaptive design. An adaptive design not in the sense that it's optimal, but rather that statistically it leads to fitness gains, right? Statistically it leads to fitness gains, couched in terms of survival and reproduction. Now this applies to behavior. If it applies to behavior, it applies to communication by definition, because communicative behavior is behavior. And this stance applied to communication, animal communication, is signaling theory. And signaling theory thinks of animal communication not in terms of its form, which is like the dominant or intuitive approach to animal communication, but rather applies the tools, formal tools, mostly game theory, to the analysis of costs and benefits. Right? So the approach is that of costs and benefits rather than form. So this can be intuitively illustrated like a very, very good, very commonsensical approach to a murder case, right? If you were a detective, what would you consider first? Where would you start on a murder case? And that's a question. There it is, right? Yes. Okay. So there are numerous approaches, right? You can start with the question who had the rifle. You can start with the question who had the access to the house, like the butler, right? Who knew the dog that they were let into the house, etc., etc. But you can also start with the motive, right? Who had the motive? Who stood to gain or lose from the killing, right? And this is the approach to analyze. This is taken metaphorically to animal communication, to analyze the costs and benefits, right? Okay, and it's a very different approach, or it's not a common approach, right? Because usually the focus of animal communication is on form, etc. Okay, so far so good. Now, starting from the seminal paper or legendary paper by Krebs and Dawkins, this unfolds starting from the alignment of interest. So alignment of interest is the key variable that predicts gradually everything else. And here it is where it reveals, right, that it's a bird's eye view, right? And you can point to many inconsistencies or incompletenesses, but on a gross level, so to say, overall level, this stands that alignment of interest predicts reliability predicts cost, and cost predicts form. So there could be two kind of states of alignment of interest. One, there can be like complete or almost complete alignment of interests, and there can be partial conflict of interest that I call disalignment of interest. Now this is much more, let me try using this. This is much more common. This is almost always the case, because alignment of interest means such a perfect alignment of interest that if we were to apply this to humans, for example, it wouldn't matter. You know, we win a lottery ticket together with somebody, right? And to neither of us it matters who gets the $100,000, because our interests are so closely aligned. So this is very rare. Okay, so again, alignment of interests predicts reliability. If our interests are aligned, communication between us is totally reliable because there is no motivation, there is no incentive for deception, for manipulation. This predicts cost, this predicts form. That was the insight by Krebs and Dawkins. The way it works is that if you have disalignment of interest, then you can't trust communication as a default, right? At least as a default. So as a default, there is distrust. This typically, that's what they say, and this has been qualified in many ways, leads to costly signals that as a consequence of that, display this cost, that are ritualized, loud, repetitive, conspicuous, exaggerated. They call them expensive hype. Now, if you have alignment of interests, you can expect communication as a default, at least, to be reliable, right? So reliability is guaranteed by trust, which, of course, results from alignment of interest. Trust leads, their insight again, to cheap signals that are subtle, efficient, inconspicuous, conspiratorial whispers. So the stereotypical examples here, that would be the communication of bees. And here in this orange spectrum, it would be peacock's tail, even though peacock's tail is morphology, but it's still communication. So that's how broad the approach is. It explains both morphology and behavior, right? Communicative morphology and communicative behavior, so to say. Now, this is where we step in with our magic bullet, and we say that at some time during human evolution, there must have happened something that put human communication or hominin communication on the blue trajectory, and we call this platform of trust. And we don't know where it came from, we don't know what it is exactly, and there are answers, of course, such as cooperative breeding was the case, maybe interdependence, like ecological interdependence that led to more cooperation. So there are attempts. So the platform of trust is a descriptive notion, right? It's not an explanatory notion. It's a name, essentially, that says human communication is in the blue spectrum, right? So humans behave as if, communicatively, as if their interests were aligned. So humans, as a default, exchange messages that are trusted as a default, okay? Good. So far, so good. Now, yes, an important point, an important distinction introduced by Maynard, Smith, and Harper between types of costs. So there is efficacy cost and there is strategic cost. Efficacy cost is what you have to pay for your message to get through, like the absolute minimum, right? So for example, if I start like this, there is not enough efficacy cost, right? Because you couldn't hear me. So I need to be at least that loud for you to hear me. I need to pay at least that cost, okay? This is efficacy cost. This is strategic cost, right? So this is paid on top of efficacy cost to signal something additional, right? And in animals, this is, so you can imagine like a cry of pain that is very intense, and the intensity of the cry is like proof of the intensity of the pain. But in animals, you can think of it again like the case of peacock's tail.
Sounds like Misha during dinners.
Okay. Yes, there are many applications. In fact, okay, good. So you have so the matrix is like this, and not sure if you can see efficacy cost here, but it's there, right? So if there is this alignment of interest, there is distrust between communicators as a default. In order to communicate, you have to pay efficacy cost, right? Because in order to communicate anything, you have to pay efficacy cost. But on top of that, but there is no reliability, right? So to guarantee reliability on top of the efficacy cost, you need to pay strategic cost. Now, if you have a platform of trust, right, whether or not your interests are aligned, you kind of introduce trust by fiat, okay? You have to pay efficacy cost because you have to, and then you don't have to pay strategic cost on top of that, right? Because this reliability is already guaranteed by the platform of trust, at least as a default. Now, what else a platform of trust does, metaphorically here illustrated with colors, is it puts So it enables information donation, right? So it enables honest sharing of information. Jordan would say it would enable sign-based communication for the game theoretic reasons, signaling theory reasons. But it also, what it also does by the same move is it puts communication in the blue spectrum, right? This is critical to our argument here in this presentation, because once it is in the blue spectrum, it introduces pressures for trust-based efficiency, right? So you remember the blue path of the evolution of communication, B's example, is cheap, inconspicuous, efficient, right? So it does like the double duty here, right? And the rest of our argument would be this. In the blue spectrum, in sign-based communication, information donation, right, you have pantomime and you have language, but they differ in efficiency. They differ in many things, right? But our argument would be that the main kind of architectural difference would be difference in efficiency, right? And pressures for efficiency transform high-cost pantomime into low-cost language, right? So the argument is there is no strategic cost, right? Because we don't need strategic cost. This is removed. Communication can develop, expressivity can develop in the lack of strategic cost. Tom Scott Phillips would say expression is unleashed by the removal of strategic cost, but still there is a difference of cost between pantomime and language, right? Pantomime is high efficacy cost. Just to ensure that my message is understood through pantomime, I have to expend a lot of energy, maybe a lot of mental effort. It's also costly in terms of mistakes, as Michael pointed out several times in his publications. So there are also all sorts of costs, right? And language is low efficacy cost. That's the difference. Also, the result is that a transparent system transforms into an efficient system. There is a trade-off. Okay? So efficiency, we have been talking in terms of cost so far, but efficiency can be understood in terms of minimizing cost, but also maximizing information transfer. So you can probably, to capture both dimensions, you can say that an efficient system maximizes information transfer per unit cost, or per unit time, perhaps, as well. That's an efficient system. Good. And again, we don't claim that this pressure is the only pressure acting on communicative systems, because there are many pressures, sometimes conflicting pressures acting on communicative systems, right? So this is one illustration of pressures acting specifically on language. We are not talking about language yet, we are talking about communicative systems. But they are similar. So, for example, social factors like development of different local accents, right? Learning biases, working memory, and so on and so forth. All of these pressures are real, but we will again set them aside because, or put them aside, because we argue that the main architectural, not architectural constraint, but the main pressure is that for efficiency. In the blue spectrum, of course, right? That's the key. All right, so in terms of conclusions, alignment of interest determines reliability, which determines cost, which determines form. This is the insight by Krebs and Dawkins. We would like to intervene here, right? And we want to say, if you have reliability, this determines cost, this determines form. Platform of trust kind of assures reliability. How? This is still a mystery, or at least a puzzle, right? If not a mystery, then a puzzle. Platform of trust removes strategic cost, but it also creates or leads to pressures for efficiency. So it puts the communication in the blue spectrum and predicts an efficient system. And a final claim, a final plank of our argument, pressures for efficiency transform the original pantomime, the original human communicative system into language. And the way it works is this. So this is the paper by Jordan co-authored with us. Communication can be more or less pantomimic on several dimensions, right? Such as iconic ground, more primary iconicity, etc. The example would be this, right? My favorite example, pantomiming walking. Okay. all right? Walking. And then you can pantomime walking like this as well, right? The first is more pantomimic because it has more iconic ground. The other has more symbolic ground. The first is more primary iconicity. The latter is more secondary iconicity. The former is more using the entire body. This is key. The latter is using less of the body. First person perspective versus third person perspective, and so on and so forth. Okay, now we want to observe. We want to pick up the ball and run with it, so to say. That this first example is more pantomimic and it's also more transparent, right? If you don't know what I'm pantomiming, it's easier to understand this whole body pantomime. It's more transparent, right? But the latter is more efficient, right? It takes much less energy to do this than to do the bipedal walking, right? Which I don't even want to do now because of the energy requirements. All right, good. So from more to less pantomimic, there is increase in efficiency, but decrease in transparency. There is a trade-off. Okay. The argument would be this. As you go from more pantomimic to less pantomimic, because of the pressures for efficiency, if you continue to go in this direction, you get language. Right? And this may be very controversial, and I welcome the controversy because there may be many details to iron out. But yes, that would be the argument. Okay.
Cheers, thank you. I'm a man of smaller ideas as well. I'm going to present to you. So to reiterate, we have this pressure for efficiency that works on pantomime, and it causes pantomime to evolve towards less pantomimic forms. That is such, as Wacewicz said, depend on more on secondary iconicity. They depend more on symbolic ground, although we have, of course, iconic motivation. They depend more on third person rather than, that is, observer viewpoint rather than first person perspective or character viewpoint. And as Wacewicz explained, this pressure serves to reduce efficacy costs. Because like we think that strategic cost, once we have a platform of trust, is no longer the problem. So this is the cost of producing signals, but also the cognitive cost of understanding them. And so we have this situation. And I guess to explain the moment, the evolutionary moment here, it is useful to appeal to Michael Arbib's idea of protosign. And for us, like the view that we articulate with Jordan, this may be a bit misleading or controversial because we understand pantomime as fully fledged sign. So for example, when I perform the pantomime of hammering, this stands for a certain object, that is the activity of hammering. There is a symmetry between those, so the pantomime stands for the action and not the other way around. So this is a sign. But I think protosign is useful because not because of the name itself, but what it actually means. So this is a mixture of iconicity and convention, which required reduced effort both to generate and to interpret. And this is kind of the evolutionary moment that we are talking about here. So how it happens, there seems to be a consensus, or a large consensus, that is primarily the effect of cultural evolution. So we have the vertical dimension, that is repeated interactions between communicators, and horizontal dimension, that is transmission between generations of communicators. However, as shown by many naturalistic but also experimental studies, usually interaction is enough. And as I'm going to show a little bit later, sometimes even interaction in its standard form is not necessary to at least initiate this process. And here there's a very nice passage from Anna Minero's work. So I will read it. This is, of course, for Sao Tome and Principe sign language, but I think it nicely captures the evolutionary dynamics that we're talking here. So as time went by, the pressure to have a more efficient system, effortless in terms of articulation, and quicker to produce, led to the emergence of new signs in which iconicity, as a major vehicle of semantic transmission, was transformed into a lighter version, with participants giving up the whole body commitment and beginning to use the manual articulators as a preferred source. So in very commonsensical, simple but useful terms, I think it explains the evolutionary moment when pantomime starts to evolve into proto-sign. And now I would like to reflect a little bit on what happens here. Following Robert, Lewandowski and Galantucci, we could say that this is actually simplification of meaningful forms. So they become more schematic, hence they are easier to reproduce. So it's easier for a particular communicator to use the same or similar form whenever he or she refers to a particular object. But importantly, it's also easier for a number of communicators to use the same form. So in the latter aspect, we are talking about conventionalization, as Michel remarked yesterday, usualization, depending on the social environment where it is happening. Okay, so now I will give you a few examples to illustrate this process, both experimental and naturalistic. So this process is not limited to pantomime, but actually is quite robust whenever we deal with systems that are based on visual signs. So this is the famous study by Garrett and colleagues in the guessing game paradigm, where they had participants develop a communication system from scratch. We'll hear about kitchen appliances, or household appliances rather. So we can see the progression from very robustly iconic, primary iconic forms to very schematic forms, although the iconic motivation is visible when you know the context, and that's secondary iconicity. And they also observed that with this progression, participants started to share those forms, which boosted communicative success. The relevant example would, for example, be taken from, should be taken from Anna Minero's work, and this is not very well visible, but I guess Anna can recognize this sign, hopefully. So that's the sign for the plane. We'll first use the whole body, and then gradually you use just one hand, the dominant hand. So you have the simplification of meaning. First you have whole body movements, but also a type of enacting, personification, where the body is mapped onto the structure of the plane. And then we have the representational strategy using just one hand. Then motion capture experiments are very useful at demonstrating this simplification in motion capture terms, of course. So here we have a study by Nambu Di Ripak. This was used with Kinect, and also they had participants involved in a guessing game in which, using gesture, they had to communicate various reference, animate, inanimate, also actions. So what we see here is that communicative success improved, but importantly, trial lengths were shortened. They played in 4 rounds. So if you will go from round to round, then the time was shorter for them to produce these gestures. The volume of gestures decreased. So this is the second round, the third round, and the fourth round. So this would be the volume of gestures for different diets that were interacting through the rounds, the second, third, and fourth. And also they measured path or distance traveled by hands, and it also significantly decreased. So this is the wrist travel distance, and this is, I think, particularly useful. So you will have second round, third round, and fourth round. The first round was just for training. Okay. Then I would like to show you a video from our pantomime corpus, and here we have the actor that is actually enacting this scene. That is the woman slapping the man. Okay, so here we also see simplification of forms, and this example is quite interesting because it didn't involve this kind of emergent pantomime or simplified pantomime. Did not involve any interaction. We just had participants that had to record 20 transitive events with different participants like man, woman, boy, girl. And usually towards the end of the recordings, they would come up with such simplified pantomimes. But this is not just simplification. What we can see here, I think we could call compositionality. So we have like this indexes. So this he kind of developed as the index or marker of age, that is adult child, and then he developed these markers. This would be woman, and this would be man. Not very politically correct, but it turned out to be quite effective. So here we would have the situation in which you have two simplified, meaningful elements in which you combine in order to derive kind of a new meaning. And I think it also illustrates what is sometimes referred, particularly by Roberts and colleagues, as combinatoriality. And I'm not saying that these two processes are distinct. Yes, they kind of highlight different aspects. So it will be the development of a limited number of units that can be combined and recombined. Yes, so then we have the system. When we talk about the evolution of pantomime, we have the system that makes use of simple forms, but such that can be combined, recombined, so the expressive power of the system increases. Okay, so we have this situation when we go beyond proto-sign towards kind of more language-like features, compositionality and combinatoriality. And what is the end of this trajectory? Here, I guess, since we are in the bodily, visual bodily modality, I think the most fitting example would be from emergent sign languages. So we could consult Wendy Sandler's work on dedicated gesture. So first there is a situation like Wendy is not very keen to admit that. But first, the little that we know about the first signs in Al Said Bedouin, they involve the whole body. When to produce one sign, you would use a lot of articulators like hands, legs, also face, to indicate, for example, emotional balance. And then once the signs become simplified and you tend to use the dominant hand to transmit lexical information, then other articulators can be recruited to transfer other types of information, such as grammatical markers, discourse markers, pragmatic markers. So here we have a fully fledged language that is capable of expressing a lot of information, that is very efficient in the sense that we are talking about. These processes also happen in the lab on a limited scale. So this is the study by Motamedi and colleagues, and they had participants who were asked to communicate sentences that involve two arguments, Hannah and Sarah, and these arguments could be either agents, or they could indicate goal or recipient, or they may not be present at all. As you can see, this is interactive iterated design. So basically, dyads were interacting, trying to communicate, being involved in this guessing game. And then the end product of these interactions was shown to the next dyad in the training session. And all these chains evolved some kind of consistent ways of marking the two arguments, that is, telling Sarah from Hannah, either by sort of numerical indexing, which is the first example, or by using angularization with the torso, which is the second example, or indexing a particular part of space, which at least is a little bit reminiscent of what happens in sign languages. The floor is yours.
All right. So driving towards a conclusion, we thought of future directions, maybe not future directions, but a couple of questions that could be addressed using this entire framework of thinking in terms of transparency and efficiency of pantomime. So we singled out three questions, which are as follows. Two types of pantomime. One is pantomime as a display, and the other pantomime as information donation. The other is the question of conventionality, and then finally the question of why speech, so this modality transition problem that was mentioned in the panel yesterday. Okay, so we have two types of pantomime, and if you are not willing to call this pantomime, this is at least perhaps a precursor in terms of that it involves bodily mimesis, right? And it involves many features of pantomime. So this can be qualified as a display or ritualistic dance, for example. You can think of the haka dance as a prime example of this. Okay, but you can also think of chimpanzee displays, and they differ on a number of dimensions, right? So dyadic versus triadic mimesis, performative versus declarative. This is the key functional distinction. In terms of form or in terms of energy expenditure, here energy is wasted on purpose. Here energy is conserved, etc., etc. Right? As predicted by the orange versus the blue part of the spectrum, right? And it's actually not a spectrum. We think of it as a more or less categorical switch. Either you are in the orange or you are in the blue, right? So this is also important. Okay, so bearing this in mind, right? You can again put those forms of communication on this. Okay, so it is a spectrum, but there is a categorical dividing line, right? So displays are all orange. Energy is wasted and so on. Proto-language would be very, very efficient. Energy is conserved. Span is maximized in a hacker dance. You do all those moves that maximize span. In proto-language, you minimize span. Okay, so the standard evolutionary story would be have like the bodily, motor, cognitive prerequisites for display, and then once you grow your cognition a little bit more, you can apply this to communicate in pantomime and proto-sign, but also you can apply this to teach other individuals, right? And we would say this path or this explanation is either wrong, or if it's not wrong, then at least it's incomplete, right? Because you can't get from the orange part of the spectrum to the blue part of the spectrum just by growing, enhancing your cognition, right? You can have all the cognition you want, but you need a platform of trust to be able to donate information. Right? So the platform of trust we see as a key element, and this would be also our answer to why pantomime is rare in apes, right? So this is a conjecture, right? That apes are cognitively ready for pantomime, ready in terms of pantomime, at least in terms of motor prerequisites, but they crucially miss platform of trust more than anything else. This is the first thing. The second point would be this. A standard story is that we go from icons to symbols through conventionalization, and conventionalization implies simplification, reduction, etc., etc. And I would like to remark, or we would like to remark, that it doesn't need to be the case at all, right? So you can have conventions that are extremely costly, right? Extremely energy wasteful in terms of energy, and so on and so forth, right? Because hacker dance is also conventionalized. Rituals are conventionalized, and rituals are powerful resource burners, right? But that's the entire purpose of ritual and of display. You pay huge strategic costs, right? The strategic cost guarantees the honesty of ritual, and strategic cost guarantees the effectiveness of a display, okay? So displays can be conventionalized as well. So we say it's a little bit different, right? So you have icons, but the moment you start using icons for information donation, you are in the blue part of the spectrum with pressures for efficiency, and pressures for efficiency go through conventionalization. So conventionalization is kind of the means to reaching a more efficient system. Right? So this will be a slightly different explanation, not necessarily incompatible, but this is a different perspective, right? And then finally, why speech? You can guess our answer, right? Why don't we sign, but we speak? Our answer, so this is the answer that even if we don't want to, we have to give this answer, right? Consistent with our explanation. It's precious for efficiency all the way down, okay? Even if you imagine a stage of sign language in the evolution, which is controversial, you don't need to, the gestural theories do not compel you to have a stage of distinct sign language, but this would still be precious for efficiency, right? So we argue, or we have to argue, that speech, vocal communication, well, vocal bodily communication, but speech is more efficient than sign, right? This may be controversial, but it would be so great to check this empirically. Like in Jordan's presentation yesterday, there is a theoretical idea, and then it was put to test. Here it would be very, very great to put this to test. As a final note, we argue for a distinction between efficiency and transparency, not distinction but trade-off, right? So here we want to observe that there is also a trade-off between efficiency and transparency, right? Sign language is more transparent than speech, even though it's still not like very transparent, but it's still more transparent than speech, right? So it holds here, this principle. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Seems to be on. So, about the term sign and proto-sign, do you really need it? You know, why not directly from pantomime to proto-language? Both because the term sign, as you said, Przemek, is already in the semiotic sense, is implied in pantomime. And in the sign linguistics sign, talking about proto-sign seems to risk putting you in a corner in which you have a mono-semiotic system that is, well, a simpler form of sign language. So the question from Angelo and others, how do you avoid, you know, given the sign languages are as efficient as spoken languages nowadays. So if we strike over proto-sign and go directly from pantomime to proto-language, plus also point out that pantomime has vocalization. Pantomime is polysemiotic, consisting of gesture and vocalizations. It's the gestures that become less pantomimic. It's not the pantomime, the gestures become less pantomimic, but the vocalizations that are there, they would become more symbolic. So I think it would be in line with your theory, and it's not just because there's less energy needed to perform vocalizations, that whole body movements, but also because their lesser potential for iconicity may be communicative efficacious, right? You can avoid the ambiguity between objects and actions by actually using the vocal channel rather than the other. So I guess to put the two questions together, if we change sign from gesture here, or pantomime, right? And pantomime consists of gestures plus vocalizations, wouldn't that help your model?
Well, we use proto-sign, and I make a note the way we use it, and because like referring how we understand pantomime and how we understand sign. And I hope that you're happy with this explanation, the hammering pantomime, to say that this is a sign. But I think it's important to, like, we are gradualists, and even in processes happen very fast. And at least in modern humans, when we put them in experimental settings or in emergent sign languages, there is this moment when pantomime, or pantomimic gesture here, like to use our term, becomes simplified. And we would like to capture this phase in evolution of a communication system. So this was our motivation. And as you've seen, I don't know how persuasive those was. I mean those elements such as compositionality or combinatoriality, they develop very quickly. So we wouldn't say probably that there is pantomime, proto-sign, and then compositionality and combinatoriality. So this would be the spectrum. It would happen very quickly, or at least it does in modern humans, but kind of theoretically or conceptually, I think it kind of makes sense to talk about less pantomimic gesture. And this would be the result of the pressure for efficiency. Like, as for vocalization, I mean, clearly, particularly when we look at experimental evidence, it is, if you allow people to be multimodal, that is to use body to communicate, gesture, but also vocalization. Vocalization does not help for referential transmission. But, so I guess there is this problem, yes? And so we may blunt the problem of modality transition, but I think it is still there, and it requires some accounting for. And I think, like Slavik said, or perhaps he didn't, then sounds are less iconic, and as system becomes more and more combinatorial, there's advantage of using sounds rather than gestures. So that's the standard argument, and we would, I guess, agree with that. I don't know, would you like to say something?
I'm happy with both. Both accounts. I'm happy with what Jordan says completely, and with your kind of addition as well.
Yeah. Thank you. And that clarifies, and we're just passing the torch. So just say that in a way, I mean, the reason that our experiment and the phase experiment have not shown an advantage for vocalization to be just an artifact of the way we have operationalized this and the people who have done it. The fact that these few studies have tried to show some advantage doesn't show that extrapolate to a million years ago when we suppose this happened.
As a follow-up, and having a sign language expert here, like our actors, when they were supposed to produce non-linguistic vocalization, non-vocal vocalization is difficult to imagine, but non-linguistic vocalization, they said that they found it very, very challenging because whenever they vocalize, and most of the time, exactly, they do it for speaking. So it would be interesting how deaf signers would find pantomime. That is when they have to, I don't know whether it would be even possible, when they have to use the body to communicate, but they are not able to use sign language. I think it may work a little bit different, but yesterday I had this idea.
Yeah. And finally, I guess you answered my question, that the way you're using proto-sign is the way I'm using proto-language. So it's not a phase between proto-sign and proto-language and language, that will make too many artificial stages.
The beginning of proto-language.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So signs come earlier. I applaud you for being brave and making this clear hypothesis from your theory and saying that somehow sign is less efficient than speech. It will take a lot to convince me that this is true, but I applaud you for being brave and making the prediction. I have a point, or an observation and a question. Modern children don't process, don't process the iconicity of sign until they're almost 4. So I have always struggled with the notion that the iconicity somehow makes sign easier or different or less. Modern children don't really attend to the iconic nature of signs for quite some time. And then my question is, and I appreciate maybe we're not looking for the right thing yet with the vocalization, but if vocalization doesn't help, how do you make the transition for speech to become compositional? If modern people aren't using vocalization, how does then speech come out as more efficient in the end?
Mm-hmm. So I want to kind of connect that to Jordan's questions and Przemek's response. So we had a previous study in which vocalization on top of pantomime did not help referentially. We did a post-study in which we determined that the emotional valence of vocalization could still be recognized. So for example, there was pushing and slapping, and if actors performed vocalizations with those negative valence effects, it was guessed over chance that it was a negative event rather than kissing or waving to, which is a positive event. So that's one point. Vocalization didn't help. We think that there might be a cultural difference. And we only have anecdotal evidence, but people keep telling, when you ask this question, people keep confirming again anecdotally that in weird Western cultures, there is this bias or whatever against non-linguistic vocalization for fear of sounding stupid, right? But this does not apply to all cultures in the world, which are much more vocal than we are, non-linguistically vocal. So that's one point. Yes, and the question was about how vocalization could help. Iconicity, yes. So iconicity in children, so that's one kind of source of evidence, but we can rely on other sources of evidence, and one would be emergent sign language studies, right? And the other would be intercultural communication. So the first stage that we see there is more pantomimic, right? If you go, Przemek knows more about it, explorers in in the old day. If they went to cultures which they didn't have a language in common and a cultural ground in common, they relied on pantomimes, and that was effective.
But they are already symbol-using brains.
Yes.
And I think this is the difference. With the children, what we're seeing is coming into the function of language and symbolization, and they reach sign before they understand about its iconicity.
Yeah, I guess so. So that can be the answer, right? That our brain, despite this uniformitarian assumption, right, which we use in our, like for example, semiotic experiments, right? We assume that what stands for humans today and the outcomes of the experiment kind of applies, not historically, but in evolutionary time. But there are limitations to this uniformitarian stance as well. So this can be the answer. I wonder if Przemek wants to add something on top of that.
I mean, it's always difficult. I mean, it's ontogeny development has always, like, we have to take this source into account. And, well, the question is, you know, the extent of recapitulation that you can posit, and there's no really answer to that. And when we talk about our pre-linguistic ancestors who didn't have language, it doesn't mean, like for us, that they were not sign users. So I guess that's an important thing to say. So they would live in socially complex structures. I think they had to have a way to coordinate and to use signs as we use it. So I guess there is no answer to that, but the fact that we sort of seriously treat, for example, experimental data, all this anecdotal data from the age of exploration, I think it may also make sense. Yeah.
I also want to add one more thing, because there was another point about the efficiency of sign language. I can venture a prediction, and I have no prior knowledge on the prediction, so you can verify it. If we have like equal bimodal bilinguals speaking to each other, do they use sign or do they use speech? Because my prediction or our prediction would be that they use speech preferentially, and there could be like a lot of confounds of all sorts. But you know, if you have like million data points, right? The prediction is that speech should be used more frequently.
Okay, any other questions from the room?
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I was wondering if in modern sign languages, established ones, if classifiers, you know, sign language classifiers would be pantomime, because it's a lot of like things like that, to walk, things like that, to say no and yes, and they vary so much from language to language, you know, and even in the same language, that I was wondering if it's not residual, if it's not a fossil of one's pantomimic communication. They can do entire narratives based on classifiers. Deaf can do that. So it would be maybe, it was just a kind of a thought passing by, but...
Well, I mean, perhaps there's a problem with reading when the sound that Cook has a very clear idea about that. But yeah, I guess we would agree, or it wouldn't go against what we say. So this would be kind of those evolved pantomimic gestures that are simple, simpler. That's why they become more combinatorial. So thank you for this observation. I guess we actually like it.
Yes, yes. And I also want to jump in and say thank you back for this wonderful empirical material that suits our theory so well.
Yeah, just a quick question. You talk about speech, and you say, okay, let's use it because the articulators are more efficient. But the problem is that most primates don't have speech. So are you to say that assuming that humans did have song before they had pantomime and then eventually could co-opt the vocal apparatus? Because otherwise it's very, very costly to invent a new control system to be able to employ speech to use its efficiency.
I guess so. I guess so. So the explanation, the prediction would be that the cortical from the cortex to the throat connections that are evolutionarily novel in humans, right? They can only develop after we have a platform of trust, because they would specifically subserve an efficient system of communication. So you don't expect them before that, right? So this is something that evolves for increasing vocal control as vocalization takes more and more of the referential burden, right? So it's vocalization is always there, right? And it expresses like emotional signals and complements communication, but then its role increases gradually. That would be the story.
Well, the claim is that vocal control for emotions and a few calls is different from flexible vocal control. But I think maybe we agree, but it's just that there has to be that adaptive pressure is actually on a long scale, biological, rather than as in the cases we're talking about, pantomime going from the legs to the hands, being on a short scale, purely performative.
I think so, yeah. So yeah, if there is a difference between our accounts, it would be that on this account specifically, you don't get pressures for increased vocal control until you get a platform of trust. So yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I wanted to ask about efficiency and cost. Do you think that it's possible that actually in transition from sign to speech, cost of some linguistic actions is growing rather than getting smaller? What I'm thinking about is politeness. I can imagine, for example, requests in using signs which are getting very complicated when you are using speech and strategies related to politeness. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question, politeness. So the reason that we are interested, or at least I'm interested in linguistic politeness, is because it's a special area of language, right? And it's related to, again, to cost benefit, because in order to be polite, you have to pay some costs, right? Because politeness can't be all cheap, because it wouldn't have any value, right? So yes, but the costs are of different nature. They don't need to be of energetic nature, but they could be of like symbolic nature, like making a posture, social nature, making a posture small, and etc. I mean, I guess it should need to be tested. And perhaps one observation to add on that, because you say costs can increase. Tecumseh says, right? When we speak, we also wave our hands about, which is also super energetically costly, right? So it kind of falsifies this prediction that speech, because speech is vocalization and co-speech gesture. That's how I understand speech. But it might be that it maximizes information transfer per unit time. That would be, that's, you know, those are speculations derived from the theory. This should be tested.
Okay, I have noticed. Because we actually have quite a few of them here. The first comment from Petr Bosch, he writes, the efficiency of speech versus sign is to some extent dependent on social context. Sometimes making the sound is disturbing. Some cultures have a sign language in parallel to spoken language, so the direction sign to speech is not obvious. So I guess, Sławek, you replied to that partially, but perhaps would like to add something?
That it's a bird's eye view picture, right? So you will find many exceptions, but if you quantify all instances of speech use versus sign use, there would be like 60 to 40%, proportion. If that's understandable, right? In the grand scheme of things, this prediction should hold.
Okay, another question from Francesco Ferretti. Francesco writes, thank you for the talk. My question is about platform of trust. Is it a prerequisite of communication, a starting point, or the result of a continuous alignment characterized by the fact that the starting point of the communication is the diversity of the points of view of the interlocutors, and therefore a form of initial disagreement?
I guess we very strongly argue that the platform of trust is necessary for sign use. And why? I think, to relate to what Jordan said, it's very easy to lie with signs. It's much more difficult with displays. Yeah? So this would be the difference between strategic cost, when you have to put a lot of effort to persuade the interlocutor that you actually mean it, and efficiency cost. One strategic cost is disappears because there is a platform of trust. And if we didn't have platform of trust, there would be inflation. Yeah? So, nobody would believe what we say or what we try to communicate, because there would be this assumption whether it's true or not. So this is kind of a fundamental point that we would like to make.
Yes. Yeah, so to us, like, platform of trust is necessary for information donation, for cheapest but honest, massive referential communication, for sign-based communication. You can express it in different ways. So perhaps there is a difference between us in how we understand this platform of trust.
Okay, thank you. And finally, a question from Cornelia Müller. She writes, I agree on the idea that pantomime is multimodal and the separation between oral and gestural is a post hoc to actual communication. What do you think is the role of cooperative action, of doing things together, for an evolving primacy of oral over gestural signed languages? Vocal languages free the hands for doing things together.
I mean, it could be. It's likely we do not have any specific point or hypothesis here, but it's also, I guess, reduced cost if you can. So there are all those arguments. Like, for example, Tecumseh says, well, speech frees the hands for other action, but he says, but it engages your mouth, and early hominins would have used their mouths for like a lot more than we now. For example, as a third hand, also for chewing, because there was a lot of chewing. So it's a complex argument, but essentially I agree, right? That if there is a lot of collaborative action, as proposed by, for example, Tomasello, proposed by Beecher recently, Levinson. So if there is a lot of like interdependent collaborative action, like humans stop being like individuals, but started like close collaborative communities and had to collaborate in real life to get food, extractive foraging, and so on and so forth. Speech would have been useful for coordinating action. So
I guess like Levinson, like he would make this point strong, like he goes for multimodal, perhaps we should say polysemiotic communication on this path of evolution of language, and then vocalization would be, the semiotic reasons here that is very useful for that and makes a lot of arguments. So yes.
Okay, and perhaps one final question from the audience, and then we'll move on to our next speaker.
Thank you again. I felt that many of the questions that were expressing some discomfort with this figure that is shown there is the term sign. So if we substitute it with pantomime, I think much of the problems will disappear. Both in terms of efficiency, and also because it's good to say, Slavic, that you understood speech there at the end as polysemiotic. So speech was not just speech was also gesture. Because otherwise, your efficiency taken simplistically would seem to imply monosemiosis, monomodality as the ideal, because it's at least energetic, right? but this is not pantomime. So it has to be from polysemiotic to post-semiotic, but the information load goes from gesture towards speech, but gesture remains, and proto speech was the support there.
I think so.
Yes?
Okay, thank you. So the final round of applause. Thank you for the presentation once again.